Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. It reminds me I should turn off my phone as well. Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's talk by Jean Bethke Elshtain on the topic Religious Freedom and the Politics of Proselytism. Jean, who many of you know, both through her reputation and through collaborations of various kinds, is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago. And she's also a member of our community here at Georgetown as the holder of the Thomas and Dorothy Levy Chair in the Foundations of American Freedom and as a senior fellow here at the Berkeley Center. As you know, she's a tremendously influential and important scholar on a wide range of topics: religious ethics and war, family and feminist theory, democracy and modern political thought. I'm just going to mention two of her more recent important publications, two books. One from 2003, Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World. And more recently from 2008, Sovereignties, God, State, and Self, which grew out of the Gifford lectures that she gave in 2006. Jean has held a number of distinguished professorships and lectureships. She's been awarded 9 honorary degrees. Is that?
Yeah.
And counting.
I think.
She was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1996. And in 2006, President Bush appointed her to the Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I could go on, but we want to get to the presentation and discussion. I do want to conclude by referencing the fact that Jean is part of our Religious Freedom Project here at Georgetown and at the Berkeley Center. As many of you know, my colleague Tom Farr secured a grant from the Templeton Foundation for a multi-year exploration of religious freedom as an interdisciplinary field of inquiry. And he and Tim Shaw, another colleague at the center, have assembled a world-class team of scholars across disciplines to explore these issues over the coming years. And Jean, we're delighted that you're part of that team. Of course, the topic of tonight's talk gets precisely at some of those issues, and Jean's going to speak for about 40 minutes, which will leave us ample time for discussion and conversation. So please join me in welcoming Jean Bethke Elshtain.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on a Friday afternoon to do this. I should say that my voice has been well used already today, thanks to the gentleman you see to my left and another gentleman to my left, Tom Farr and Tim Shaw, because we've had a very interesting discussion today on the question of religious freedom and its different religious contexts in which it is to be understood, and what are the principles internal to different faith traditions that can sustain religious freedom, freedom of religious practice, and indeed can we be said to have cultural and conceptual ways of understanding one another. Do we mean the same thing when we talk about religious freedom in different traditions? So we've had a good discussion, and what I'm going to offer here briefly is, in a sense, right on the money, so to speak, of that particular topic. Also, at some point, I should forewarn you, if I seem to be saying words but I'm making no sense, I'm probably sleep talking rather than sleepwalking, because I was foolish enough to get up at 3:30 a.m. to watch the royal wedding this morning, and I'm now wondering if that was the wisest decision I ever made. But at any rate, just forewarn me. Someone sort of do something to wake me up if I'm meandering, right? So with that, let me begin, and I'm going to begin with the notion of proselytization. Not an easy word to say. Proselytizing. Preaching the good word is central, as you know, to some religious traditions, and my focus in the talk will be on Christianity. As you know, the first Great Commission spoken by Jesus was the call to go forth and preach the gospel to all lands. This was to be done peacefully, but it was to be done. The notion was one did not impose one's faith, but one made it manifest. One preaches it, one calls upon others to consider it. So a question that occurs immediately is whether this call to preach is compatible with what we ordinarily take toleration to be, to go out and to proselytize. I insist that it is, and that we need not hunker down encased in our own belief systems. We may be called upon to share them, joyfully but diligently, and that a decent, tolerant society should have no problem with this, nor should the international community. Now, it's no easy task to sort out how religious toleration has been understood in the Western democracies, to examine assaults on the idea of toleration from some quarters, and to unpack the claim that public freedom to proselytize is part and parcel of a robust regime of toleration, one that I'm going to call deep toleration, based on the insistence that we can, at one and the same time, tolerate religious pluralism and advocate for the truth of our own faith. Now, the story of the emergence of a regime of toleration in the West is a long and complex one. Suffice to say, and I'll say more about this as we move along, that a certain privatization of religion was part of the deal. One worshiped publicly, but the view emerged over time that the whole thing came down finally to what my own conscience told me, assuming thereby much of what needs to be understood and explained, namely the formation of conscience itself. Now, that's an issue, unfortunately, I'm going to have to bracket for now in the interest of time, but the question of moral formation does lurk in any discussion of this sort. How are people formed such that conscience even matters? So let's go to privatization, my own conscience. This notion, and I'm giving you a quick and dirty summary here, and then we'll unpack it further, invited a further subjectivization and interiorization of religion. You have your spirituality and I have mine. And if one holds this view, one stands back from claims that there are strong warrants for faith in a faith tradition based on what Augustine called faith-seeking understanding. That is, if faith is narrowed to the pinpoint of one, proselytizing comes to seem a violation of toleration, as if toleration means I expect no one ever to challenge my faith, my spirituality, and so on, precisely because it's mine. And if you raise questions about it or try to persuade me of anything else, somehow that is an attack on my identity. Now, a second major issue, in addition to the privatization of religious faith, holds that, currently we hear these arguments, that the entire notion of toleration is a rather puny one. That is, we hear people saying, I don't want toleration, I want recognition. Recognition of the sort that eschews normative distinctions as between beliefs and ways of being in the world. So equal normative acceptance, one might call this. And in this world, toleration is always referred to as mere toleration. That toleration is not enough. Now, those criticizing toleration from this direction tend to forget what a precious and fragile achievement toleration is, even as they decamp from the necessary debates any decent society must have about what is good, what is true, what is workable, and so on. Defenders of toleration, understood robustly, insist that it is foolish to the point of suicidal for those who are in a minority in any sense to undermine toleration. Toleration is their best bet, as a world of indistinguishable difference is an illusion. But a commitment to deep toleration should not be simply instrumental, for deep toleration speaks to respect for persons that lies at the heart, I would suggest, of democratic possibility, and that I think should inform the international community. So that's by way of introduction. Now, with that general introduction, let me turn to the philosopher that helps me to appreciate what is at stake in toleration understood robustly. You won't be surprised at the name. The name is Charles Taylor. Taylor first became known to many of us, if you'll permit me a moment of historic scholarly formation here. Many of us, through his profound and important essays, challenging an approach in the human sciences called behaviorism, which was a dominant modality when I was studying political science. For those like myself who were clinging to the hope that there would be room for scholars who were not committed to a positivist epistemology and to the behaviorist outcropping in departments of political science, the work of Taylor was really a lifeline. He helped many of those whose training was not in philosophy proper, but in political theory, to appreciate the distinctive quality of the human sciences and to fight back when we were told that the only way to do things was to abandon the ground of meaning and values, to embrace a narrow science of verification, to ignore anthropological or ontological questions, and to hold epistemological debates at arm's length. Taylor's resounding claim, backed up with richly elaborate argument, that the human sciences cannot be wertfrei or value-free because they are moral sciences, whose subject matter is the self-interpreting animal, the human person, helped to put many scholars and my time and place on our own scholarly paths. Those of you familiar with his work know that his sources of the self added much needed nuance to the question of identity, displaying in full his historic acumen and knowledge. And that volume signaled his move toward that phase of his career associated with the politics of recognition. And you see more of that in his latest master work, A Secular Age, which is a book that is now inspiring symposia and conferences worldwide. So it is the Taylor of the politics of recognition that I hope to engage in dialogue around the problematic of toleration and proselytization and what this says about regnant understandings of the self, among other things. Now, proselytization takes place when I knowingly set out to change someone else's mind about something basic to his or her identity and self-definition, like religious belief. Toleration requires that I learn to live with deep differences, even though I may disagree profoundly with another's identity and beliefs. And here, the key questions to engage within a broad framework of Taylor's politics of recognition are: is toleration pallid and inadequate, stacked up against the politics of recognition? Is proselytization compatible with the politics of recognition and a regime of toleration, or is it a challenge to it? And I'm going to take up these matters briefly because it seems to me they're just intrinsically interesting, and also because they are in need of clarification given certain forms of identity politics that are at odds with Taylor's perspective. A Taylorian politics of recognition can and should then be brought to bear against that form of identity and recognition politics that pushes either, can push in one of two ways, either in a narrowly essentialist direction, we're all hardwired all the way down and you can't change anything about us, that's just who we are, or that we're not wired at all, that we're constructed all the way down. Now, the heart of the matter, so there's no way that, in a sense, we can, if you will, from ourselves sort of push back against certain things. We're totally molded and determined by external forces. The heart of the matter here, as we explore these issues, is our understanding of the human person and in what the dignity of the person consists. Now, for Taylor, as you know, the self cannot exist apart from his or her immersion in an inescapable framework of some kind. And it is within such frameworks that we establish our orientation to the good, that our moral intuitions are engaged and formed to become solid habits, and that these moral instincts go on to become our mode of access to a world in which certain claims, ontological claims, if you will, serve as a background picture against which our own understandings are articulated. Now, Taylor argues that such background frameworks may be explicit or implicit, but we can never escape them. That is, we can't shed them, we can't step outside them. And that without orienting frameworks, we would plunge into a kind of abyss. And this is described by Taylor in quite dire terms here are his words, a kind of vertigo, terrifying emptiness, anomie, lack of purpose, and the like. Now, for citizens of liberal societies, one such framework has been a political ethic of toleration. Selves oriented to this ethic are enjoined to live and to let live, if not approve of, deep commitments different from their own. Being formed in this framework means being taught that if one is part of a majority religious or political orientation or ethnic group or race, one must imagine what it would be like to be part of a minority. And that in turn spurs appreciation of the necessity for a regime of toleration. Because if in the majority now, one might find oneself in a minority position one day. And because selves are to some extent at least self-interested, many argue that prudence alone suffices to buttress a regime of toleration. Now, in one classical sense then, the regime of toleration does not require suspending judgment as between contrasting beliefs and identities and ways of being. It does not require that, one understanding of it. Rather, it means not coercing those whose orientations one finds unintelligible and even distasteful, so long as these orientations pose no threat to public safety nor undermine the orienting framework of toleration itself. Now, because human beings are, on Taylor's words, strong evaluators, to call for persons to suspend judgment about right or wrong or better or worse is to call upon them to suspend a constitutive feature of their own moral personalities. And we can't ask people to do that. Now, there is, of course, a story behind the classical liberal regime of toleration, and it is one that speaks to dangers that are assumed to exist should persons locate themselves within frameworks that make it impossible or very difficult to speak across frameworks. In a sense, the strong evaluations of selves becomes too strong. What Taylor calls qualitative discriminations push in an exclusionary direction. We decide we really can't talk to one another. The upshot, so the story goes, is suspicion and fear, if not outright enmity and war. And that lost along the way is a humbler epistemological stance lodged in recognition of our own fallibilities, what theologians call the noetic effects of sin. To examine what Taylor's strong politics of recognition does to or for standard frameworks of toleration requires a more complete unpacking then of the received story. I apologize, this is kind of dense here at the outset, but I think it sort of opens up a bit after, I guess, some of this heavy philosophical slogging over with. The standard version of the story goes something like this. Liberal toleration saved religion from its own excesses and absolutist demands. By forcing a regime of toleration on religion, liberalism in its constitutional forms demanded that religion act more tolerantly. And so it came to pass that both sectarian groups, always meaning religious groups, and non-sectarian groups, everybody else, would learn to live happily, or if not that, at least peacefully with one another. This truce is insistently represented as a fragile one by the most ardent secularists. That is, they constantly paint a picture that suggests that religion is always threatening to get out of hand, and we have to constantly sort of keep it in its place and beat it back. And often the Spanish Inquisition is trotted out at this point in the argument as if its restoration were a serious historic possibility in 21st century Western democracies. I always think of those Monty Python skits. Do you remember them? The Spanish Inquisition trots into the room. Of course, there are other ways to tell the tale. One would be to take note of the fact that were one to do something as unseemly as a body count of victims, the anti-religious ideologies of the mid-20th century would win that contest hands down. Murderous intolerance leading to the silencing or even the elimination of those who challenge one's own views is no exclusive purview of persons with religious convictions, as I'm sure you know. As well, one might note the ways that the regime of liberal toleration has itself imposed real hardships on the free exercise of religion. And these restrictions, and I'll talk about some of them, on free exercise derive from the suspicion that religious intolerance, again, is more to be feared than anything else, and that such intolerance is to be found lurking in the interstices of even the most benign forms of religious expression. Now, a refutation of that view would hold that religion per se is not the major problem in late modern Western democracies, but rather a dogmatic disparagement of religions and their faithful as an ongoing threat to the constitutional order is, if anything, far more concerning. Now, if one traces the beginning of liberal toleration from John Locke's classic letter concerning toleration, one discovers that, and I'll see if Josh Mitchell disagrees with my reading here, but one discovers that in order for religion to be tolerated, it must in some sense be privatized. That is, there is a realm of private soulcraft and a realm of public statecraft, and never the twain shall meet. All religions, according to Locke, save atheism and Roman Catholicism, although he can get squishy on that, and Islam are to be tolerated. Constitutional scholar Michael McConnell observes that, in his words, Locke's exclusion of atheists and Catholics from toleration, that's the concern of McConnell's essay, and not what Locke has to say about Islam, but I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Locke's exclusion of atheists and Catholics from toleration cannot be dismissed as a quaint exception to his beneficent liberalism and follows logically from the ground on which his argument for toleration rested. If religious freedom, still quoting, meant nothing more than that religion should be free as long as it is irrelevant to the state, it does not mean very much, close quote. And let me just add here that what Locke has to say about Islam is that Islam is never just a religion. It is always a politics. That you can't separate politics and religion in Islam, and that the Muslim faithful, in fact, pledge their fidelity to the Mufti of Constantinople, and therefore they can't be reliable citizens because their religious belief is a political identity. All right, so that's his argument there. On Catholicism, he's worried clearly about the strong ecclesiology of the church and the worry that there may be, again, loyalty to a person external to the monarchy of England, namely the Pope, lodged in Rome. In the case of atheists, and when I teach this in class, that you get to the atheists and people always start giggling as if this is something really, really weird on Locke's part, but his argument about atheism, and it's the best discussion I've ever read is by Jeremy Waldron in a book called Locke and Equality. But there, Locke's argument was that atheists are not reliable because they won't take oaths on the Bible. They're not civically reliable. They won't help to participate in moral formation of others. They won't civically pledge themselves to help their neighbors and so forth. So those are his arguments. I'm not arguing in behalf of his arguments, but I'm just telling you what they are. Okay, so the quote that I read from McConnell was, if it's nothing more than religion is free as long as it's irrelevant to the state, it doesn't mean very much. How so? Because religion has been privatized and its meaning reduced to the subjective spiritual well-being of individual practitioners. Now, this move towards subjectivism is a general feature of modernity, according to Taylor, and he's observed this over and over again in his work. One example would be the conclusion of one of my favorite essays of his, an essay called Language and Human Nature, in the two-volume, I think it's in the second volume of the two-volume Cambridge Collected Philosophical Papers. And at the end of it, he describes what he calls the rotten compromise of the present moment, intellectually speaking, in which a crass scientism and the most subjectivist forms of expressivism coexist. And he calls that a rotten deal. In part because religious faith has not escaped this subjectivist, expressivist juggernaut, right? Now, if I'm right, Locke did his part. I don't want to say he's one of those guys, but he did his part to put Western selves, Protestant selves at the beginning, as Catholics were omitted from this regime then, on the pathway toward privatizing whatever grates or is discordant with reference to the dominant liberal paradigm. And you know how I'm using liberal here. It's not about liberals and conservatives today. It's about classical liberal political thought. Taylor notes that the struggle, quote, between technocracy and the sense of history or community, instrumental reason versus the intrinsic value of certain forms of life, the domination of nature versus the need for reconciliation with nature, that all of these struggles require, as I understand him, these sort of battle lines get drawn, that in fact people engage them robustly in a public way, but if our identities, our deepest beliefs are in fact said to be themselves privatized, then everything reducible to private experience, then it's very difficult to have the kinds of robust engagements we require. In other words, this series of moves that he thinks we've made historically undermine any robustness to the notion of a community of faith, right? Not just individuals who believe things, having a form of membership that exerts strong claims on its members. We were talking today in our discussion about the freedom of the church, libertas ecclesia, and about a strong institutional presence, again, for religious communities, not just a series of individual believers here and there. The subjectifying of religion feeds into the bad odor, I would submit, currently surrounding any hint of proselytization. Proselytizing seems at best bad manners, at worst a way to force something on me that I do not want, am not interested in, but may be gulled or intimidated into accepting. The general animus against proselytization flows from a conviction that those tilted in that direction will almost invariably be persons of overly strong religious conviction, those who are proselytizing, those therefore who, should they become dominant, would move to end the very toleration that makes their own proselytization possible. Right? The association of the word and the process of proselytization with religion doesn't help here, of course. If I'm speaking of proselytizing, no one speaks of proselytizing if I'm trying to convince you of a political issue. That's not talked about. But if I'm trying to convince you about the truth of my faith claims by contrast to yours, then that's proselytization, and that's the word that's fallen under suspicion. So in the name of preserving a regime of toleration, we must not tolerate proselytization, if this argument is making some sense to you. Now, let me give you a sense of what I mean here, the whiff of this intolerance for proselytization. Some years back, book published by Alan Wolfe, a sociologist, a book called One Nation After All, and there were a number of respondents that he and his crew of researchers interviewed, and one of them he calls in the book Jody Fields, not her real name, but it's a real quote, we're assured, and she's quoted as saying her understanding of religious tolerance: if you're a Hindu and you grew up being a Hindu, keep it to yourself. Don't impose your religion. And don't make me feel bad because I do this and you do that. Now, embedded in this comment is an intolerance of religious pluralism, should that pluralism reveal itself in a robust public way. So telling a Hindu to hide being a Hindu is scarcely a picture of liberal pluralism, or so one would think. One way or the other, then, privatizing of religion, or the view that that's what it is all about, that's what toleration requires, means that when religion shows its face, it must not take the form of actually trying to persuade someone of the truth of the religious belief being displayed. Keep it to yourself. It's your subjective view, and fine, but don't try to talk to me about it. Now, as if this were not enough to mull over, let me add a more recent trend to the mix, and I have in mind the criticism, even attacks on the notion of tolerance and toleration, emanating from certain radical postmodern directions and from those tied up in identity politics. And the argument goes something like this. I've given you a bit of a sense of it already. Toleration was always a sham. It was a way to enforce a particular Eurocentric, patriarchal Christian worldview. It was a cover-up for hegemony. Right? That's all it was. Now, in charges of this sort, you know, there's always some element of truth about imposition and so on. You can't dismiss it out of hand, but as a bald statement of the truth, clearly these claims are problematic. What atheists or pagans or non-Western religious devotees or those with once hidden sexual orientations or those who are third world or non-white seek is not toleration, but equal normative acceptance. And at this point, toleration turns into mere toleration, that thing that we kind of sneer at. This equal acceptance will be attained only when the society, any society, refuses to make any normative distinctions between and among any and all understandings of what makes a life good or worthy or a belief true, and so on. Laws, public policies, the cultural ethos must practice not only total non-discrimination, but they must refrain from making any normative distinctions of any kind between modes of belief and ways of life. Thus, for example, sexual sadomasochism between consenting adults is not to be construed as a perhaps problematic way of ordering human existence, by contrast to a faithful, respectful relationship between adults that does not involve, does not turn on pain and domination. And you know, it's what they choose to do, and if they choose to do it, we can't diss it. I mean, it's what they choose to do. That may be a rather flamboyant example, but I hope you take the point. All in all, we are enjoined to abandon orienting frameworks that offer criteria whereby we can and are obliged to make qualitative distinctions as between alternative orientations. Now, let's remind ourselves of Taylor's insistence that human beings cannot but orient themselves. He says to the good, he argues to the good, that there's a telos, a teleological argument here. That's stoutly denied. We not only can do that, Taylor says, and others are denying it, but we should, if we're going to move beyond toleration, to his politics of recognition, all right, of which toleration is a central feature. Now, those who are arguing for the no normative distinction want to drop toleration altogether, remember, as this puny thing, and move towards validation of all choices made by persons. For Taylor, we have to make these normative distinctions. That's part of the politics of recognition. And toleration is a way that we name our capacity to live with the normative distinctions thus identified. But it's difficult to do in a world in which we're enjoined to resist being judgmental, in which we're supposed to affirm and validate nearly all ways of being in the world. So those pressing the anti-toleration argument, then, see toleration as a grudging thing. You know, you're not fully endorsing and validating me. This is a grudging thing. They want approval, even as they simultaneously proclaim the radical nature of what it is they're saying and doing, as if you could have full societal validation and remain a permanent voice of radical dissent at the same time. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, you can't simultaneously do both of those things. That's another issue for another time. Those who defend toleration point out that the alternative to toleration historically has not been a happy pluralism, where we are all equally delectable peas in the pod, but instead has been a very unhappy, unpluralistic order in which religious minorities and dissenters were exiled or tortured or forced to conform, in which political dissenters often faced similar assaults, in which any inkling of a sexual orientation other than one that is considered normal was grounds for imprisonment or worse. The defenders of toleration would argue further that it is foolish to the point of suicidal for those who are a minority in any sense to undermine support for toleration. Toleration is their best bet in a world of, because a world of indistinguishable differences is illusory. There's never been such a world, and there never will be. Now, this still leaves open the matter of just how tolerant of pluralism the defenders of toleration are. Now, there are some among our legal thinkers who, their arguments that favor increased government regulation of sectarian bodies, and they see all of this as consistent with toleration somehow, increased government regulation of sectarian bodies in order to make them conform to certain modes of representation and legitimation in their internal ordering of their organizations and so forth, on the view that all associations in a constitutional order must sprout homologous forms of administration. You know, everything has to be organized like a political caucus or something along those lines. One person, one vote. Authentic tolerance based on a recognition of deep, not superficial difference here gives way before an attempt to normalize along the lines of things like this: forcing Catholic hospitals and doctors to perform abortions on the pain of punitive measures, or, and one can see this sort of thing coming, requiring that Orthodox communities ordain women, and so on. This latter attack on pluralism is mounted in the name of what equality between men and women consists in, that extends to every dimension of human life, and anything that doesn't conform to that is not to be tolerated. Somehow there's a higher kind of toleration consistent with this view of equality, and the kind of toleration that would permit these differences to exist, that undermine this view of equality. I lost the syntax of that sentence, but at any rate, that view of toleration cannot be permitted. It is a view of equality that is taken as the view of equality rather than as one among a number of competing views of equality, including those that do not require, in a democratic society, homologous internal structures for all institutions internal to the society, which is a position that would destroy plurality in the name of a particular version of equality. Now, how does Taylor help to adjudicate this matter? Laying out his position is, as we've already learning, is by no means simple. What he offers, or better said, what he believes, holds that human selves are a certain way, just constitutive of their existences. There's a complex anthropology at work. That different aspects of our embodied and intrinsically social selves are engaged with particular features of equally complex cultures and orienting frameworks. So, when Taylor argues that a rightly oriented culture is one that promotes identity recognition, what does he mean exactly? What ethical practices is he calling for? Is respect the same as approval or validation of a lifestyle choice? It's not for him, but working out the details isn't so easy. One may be obliged to recognize another as a being of equal worth, even as one repudiates that being's choices as unworthy. That is, people can in fact demean their own human dignity, and one can regret that when that happens. Now, those of us who grew up in Christian households will recall the times a mother or father said we were to love the sinner but hate the sin, which always seemed a bit complex, or to walk around in the other person's shoes for a while, for only then would our hearts unlock to pity, not as a sickly attitude of paternalism, but as a humble recognition of the humanity of the other self. So perhaps something like that is implicated here. We need to recognize the worth of another in order to be motivated to deepen our awareness of human commonalities. This awareness of commonalities through dialogical possibility will highlight particular and individual qualities that we do not want to be swamped by the commonalities. Right? Now, I may simply be redescribing the problem here, so let me take another pass at it. This is an essay called Self-Interpreting Animals. Taylor describes the ways in which I can make claims on others and they in turn can make claims on me. And he gives as an example of a felt obligation, the Good Samaritan story. One is called upon to help the other simply because this wounded and bleeding person is a child of God, a fellow creature, and a moral being. To move on, as several had done in the parable, because the man left dead by the robbers and lying off to the side of the road is a Samaritan, and Israelites have nothing to do with Samaritans, is a sinful act of cruel negligence that narrows the boundaries of the moral life. So here, Taylor says, Jesus lays on a strong obligation. It's an obligation of caritas, of charity. So one is called upon to act, not simply to feel the right way in the scheme of things within this world of mutual recognition and dialogue. And we are called to act because we are creatures of a certain sort. We are creatures who can help others and make claims on their help. An ability to respond to the claim of the stranger presupposes moral formation of a certain kind, and Taylor stresses that identities can be forged in such a way that we experience these obligations and we act on them. So although he really stands back himself from the formation question, his argument is parasitic upon some such notion. Now, let me turn to, that was a little bit of a tributary. Let me go back to the toleration as a puny thing business. Those who see it as a puny thing best exposed as bogus and done away with. They construe, remember, any attempt to proselytize in negative terms because this is by definition an assault on someone's identity. All right? The issue of toleration and the complexities of proselytization have been heavily psychologized in our time. Right? So whatever makes somebody else uncomfortable is supposed to be eschewed, is supposed to be avoided. But of course, any strong articulation of a powerful religious position is going to make somebody somewhere uncomfortable. It's bound to happen. Does this mean that we are reduced then to bleating at one another across some vast distance, but that any attempt to really engage, to really persuade, is cast as proselytizing? That's bad by definition, and we have to do away with it. Now let's unpack this just a bit further as I move to the last sort of third here, certainly, maybe more than, there's no more than a third left, I promise. Sorry, I kept thinking this would get easier, but it hasn't as I went along, but I think it will get a little bit easier before I conclude. Somewhere along the line, certainly in the last 30 years or so, a view of power took hold that disdains any distinction between coercion and manipulation and persuasion, right? If I change my mind about something, if you disdain any such distinction, if I change my mind about something after an encounter with you or after having spent time in your company, the presupposition is that I've been messed with, I've been gulled, I've been brainwashed, I've been taken for the proverbial walk down the primrose path. Power is an odd business because when we say, as many do these days, that every encounter involves power, we make it harder to distinguish between instances of real intimidation and, by contrast, those of authentic persuasion. Now, instances of intimidation, in those instances, there's an implied threat of harm unless you convert to my point of view. That's a situation of intimidation. In an instance of manipulation, I sneakily get you on my side. I manipulate you to where I want you to be. Neither of these views respect you as a moral agent who can freely weigh alternatives and make up your own mind. Persuasion, however, begins with the presupposition that you are a moral agent, a being whose dignity no one is permitted to deny or to strip from you, and from that stance of mutual respect, one offers arguments or invites your participation, your sharing in a community and its rhythms and its rituals. You do not lose anything by agreeing. Right? One, you haven't been intimidated and you haven't been manipulated. And you don't ever simply jettison everything you've believed before either. You may come to reject certain aspects of it, but you don't simply lose it all. Now that's what I take proselytization to be, that I persuade you of the truth of my beliefs, or I persuade you that this is a community of which you want to be a part. That's the kind of proselytization that it seems to me is consistent with deep toleration. Now, the upshot of all this would seem to be that both toleration and proselytizing, if I'm correct, given our confusion on this subject, are pretty badly battered as concepts and as practices. Is there any way to redeem one or the other or both? And I think there is, and I want to give you an example of that. And the example is more appropriate than I knew it was going to be, given that Sunday is the beatification of Pope Jean Paul II, and my example involves him. It's an example of both toleration and proselytization, and it comes from John Paul II's pastoral visit to Kazakhstan, of all places, in September 2001. And something struck me in the reports that I read about that visit. It was an address to young people. And this is what Jean Paul said at one point. Dear young people, this was in the capital city of Astana, allow me to profess before you with humility and pride the faith of Christians. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, made man 2,000 years ago, came to reveal to us this truth through his person and his teaching. Only in the encounter with him, the Word made flesh, do we find the fullness of self-realization and happiness. Religion itself, without the experience of the wonderful discovery of the Son of God and communion with him, who became our brother, becomes a mere set of principles, which are increasingly difficult to understand, and rules which are increasingly hard to accept. That's the end of the quote. Now, I wanted to explore why I found this moving. And certainly I think the combination of pride and humility is part of it. One places before another in all humility one's most profound beliefs. These are beliefs one holds with pride, not boastful self-pride, but with dignity, knowing that these beliefs may well be repudiated or ignored. You're not coercing people to go along with you. Also powerful, I think, is the late Pope's recognition that if religion comes down to certain sets of metaphysical first principles, then it doesn't sort of reach to the heart of what the religious experience as an experience of community is all about. So there's a fascinating dimension here, it seems to me, in his words to the Kazakh young people, because he's not just offering the faith to those who are not members of it, but it seems to me he's already calling those who are already Christians to a deeper understanding of their faith. And that, you might say, is a form of proselytizing as well. Now, here are a few other words on this pastoral visit. I'm quoting, when in a society, citizens accept one another, so they're being accepted as citizens, all right? Citizens accept one another in their respective religious beliefs. It is easier to foster among them the effective recognition of other human rights and an understanding of the values on which a peaceful and productive coexistence is based. In fact, they feel a common bond in the awareness that they are brothers and sisters because they are children of the one God, right? So that's a reference, end of quote, to toleration among religious believers, not just Christians, But the argument is that those who share deep religious beliefs, that it will be easier to foster among them the effective recognition of the other's human rights, given the depth of the meaning of their human rights to them, their right to religious free exercise, as we would put it. Unbelievers presumably have their own resources to draw upon to respect human rights, but the pontiff suggests that a bond of coexistence will have a different valence between believers and unbelievers than between believers and believers, it seems to me. And that might be a topic for discussion at some point, not necessarily today. He reminded his listeners that in little Kazakhstan, there are citizens belonging to over 100 nationalities and ethnic groups in that one small place. And they have no choice but to live side by side. Coexistence is a necessity, but, quote, bridges of solidarity and cooperation with other peoples, nations, and cultures should always be, that's the end of the quote, should always be, in my words, an imminent possibility that should be realized or might be realized, even as the gospel in all its fullness is preached, as the pontiff said, in all humility and pride. So it seems to me that there's nothing, this is not pie in the sky stuff at all, but it's a sort of filling out of what a commitment to deep toleration means as a baseline, that one is invited or called to move beyond in the direction of equal affirmation or not, as the case may be. That is, this is deep toleration. It doesn't imply equal affirmation. In some cases, one might move to that, but that's not a necessary corollary of the commitment to deep toleration. Toleration, rightly understood, permits more robust ties of civic brotherhood and sisterhood to grow and to flourish, perhaps because religious believers whose comprehensive understandings differ, but whose commitment to the dignity of the human person overlap, have more in common on some fundamental level than they have with people who don't share some deep commitment to human dignity. Toleration also permits more distance when, for example, I cannot affirm your life choices and comprehensive views. I need not validate them at all. In fact, toleration means I may argue against them, but unless you threaten the civic order in a central way, I am not permitted to deny your free exercise. Now, I have one paragraph on what it means to threaten the civic order in a central way. And then I've got a conclusion that puts these issues in an international context. So let me do that paragraph and then see how much more you can stand here as far as my continuing discussion or whether we should open it up.
We do want the conclusion.
All right. Well, let me give you this paragraph first. Developing what it means to threaten the civic order in a central way is a topic for another time. But it derives from, and it's an issue we've got to deal with nowadays, obviously, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson's rueful recognition that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. So what is one to do with groups that use freedom, claim tolerance, set about proselytizing, but what they are proselytizing for is a future order that would immediately move to destroy religious toleration, to abolish constitutional protections, and to establish a theocracy or a militant official atheism. You could go any number of directions here. Minimally, it seems to me, it means I am under no obligation as one who supports constitutional guarantees of religious freedom to work up respect for beliefs that deny the dignity of persons, preach hatred, and directly threaten me and my family and my faith and my country. So in other words, making me uncomfortable, that's going to happen. That's part of what it means to live in a pluralistic society where people's deep beliefs differ. We're going to be uncomfortable at different points. But I don't think that it commits one to, it's not the same as committing one to the view that there is nothing that you can say or do if those who, to those or with those who are using freedom and claiming toleration in order to destroy a whole society devoted to freedom and toleration. So I am enjoined to say a bit more and get to the conclusion. So I'll do that very quickly. Because when I was working on this essay, Tom said, you know, you've got to say something about the international context. So I went ahead to do some of that. And it begins, again, with the dialogic nature of selves and communities. And I've said enough about that, I think. So let me go to, there is more Taylor here, but you've probably had quite enough right now of Mr. Taylor for the afternoon. Let me go to this question. How relevant is deep toleration in the international sphere? Beyond the nation state, it might be argued, historic legacies and power asymmetries rule out the kind of dialogic interaction at the heart of Taylor's vision. Critics of proselytization typically point to centuries of missionary activity in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, an enterprise that was often backed by state power and sometimes even the force of arms. Today, the international playing field remains unequal, they argue, as the United States and its allies, among the wealthiest and most dynamic Christian communities, maintain a predominant position within the global national political economy. Under such conditions, these critics argue, support for proselytization is support for the exploitation of the weak by the strong. Now here's my response to that. Deep toleration that allows for the possibility of persuasion and proselytization is more, not less vital in the international context. At a most fundamental level, deep toleration resonates with the idea of universal human rights. That's the point that we ended up with this afternoon, about how, whatever the terms of its historic emergence, religious freedom, the ideals of toleration, and so on, what's happened is the universalization, the globalization, if you will, of notions of freedom and human rights. Those have all been unleashed in the world. Opposition to proselytization is opposition to a central dimension of religious freedom, and therefore incompatible with a robust international human rights regime. To draw a distinction between having a religion and sharing that religion with others is to truncate religious freedom. It is also to curtail freedom of expression, assembly, and political participation. A robust norm of international religious freedom, including the right to proselytize, is central to a full understanding of human rights, it seems to me, of universal human rights. Now, the view that power asymmetries in the world rule out by definition any dialogical interaction seems to me unpersuasive, because in every human relationship, from the family to the nation to the international scene, you're going to have some asymmetries of some sort. That doesn't eliminate the possibility of dialogue. If anything, it is the perennial fact of inequality that makes dialogue ever more important, that makes deep toleration more, not less important. Because it is through the exchange of ideas, through argument and evidence, through claim and counterclaim, that human beings in social settings engage in a search for truth about what is important to them, about how to live together. So the ability to think critically, to communicate, to persuade, and to be persuaded is part of what defines our humanity. Historically, the freedom to speak one's mind, including religious witness, has often proved to be a weapon of the weak in the face of the strong. That's what the weak had available to them. And you could think in our own society of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement as a salient example of that. To restrict proselytization not only violates a basic human right, it also curtails an open exchange of ideas and a politics of recognition that may challenge and not simply reinforce existing power relationships. I think that's probably enough. I just underscore that last point further in yet another paragraph, but you've been awfully patient with a pretty dense paper. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and we'll have some questions. Thanks. Thank you. And it flowed smoothly in my mind when I was reading it over, but I realized it's pretty heavy lifting. So I hope you could hang in there with it. I'm sorry about that. Some things are easier to read than to listen to, and I'm afraid this may be one of them. But I'll start in the back and work my way to the front. Yeah, right there, the gentleman there.
Appreciate your comments.
Of course, thank you.
And
Could you just introduce yourself very briefly?
my name is Dilip Thade. I'm with Seven Stars Foundation.
Okay.
I'm a religious student.
Okay.
Toleration, even deep toleration, is really a 20th century concept. In today's day, when we have multi-faith, multi-thought, we must accept the fact, this is what I feel, accept and revere the fact that many people have different paths to seeking the truth, to their liberation. And as a result, if once you accept that there are several paths to the truth, and when what you follow is one path, proselytization by definition tries to ignore that concept and says, my path is better than yours, so please come to my path. And that is not accepting all other religions or all other faiths on an equal ground. I'd like your insight into that, because I'm heavily involved with the interfaith, and we are trying to promote to our next generation as well as amongst ourselves that we respect everybody's faith. Everybody has a choice to select whatever faith they want to follow to reach the ultimate truth. And proselytizing is essentially violating that principle of allowing people to follow their own faith.
Well, I don't see how you arrive at that conclusion, because it seems to me that one way that we find out about other possibilities in order to choose our own is by hearing those other possibilities described and preached and made manifest before us. If I go out and try to persuade you of the truth of my religious faith, I open myself up to persuasion from you as well. It's not a one-way street, because if it's a situation of persuasion, the status of the people involved, let's assume two people, as moral agents, is preserved. It's not obliterated. If I put a gun to your head and said, you better believe this, then of course that's completely unacceptable. That's intimidation. As I said, if I do some sneaky things to get you to agree with me, that's manipulation. But I don't know how we can oppose peaceful persuasion. I mean, that's the way dialogue goes forward. That's the way we engage one another on a whole range of issues, not just on religious questions. And if you believe that part of our ineffable human dignity lies in our capacity to make moral choices, then it strikes me that it would be very odd to move from that stance of human dignity to try to disarticulate possible dialogic moments, that might enable me to understand things I didn't otherwise understand, or for me to persuade someone else of something that he or she didn't know of before. So there's nothing inconsistent, that's not incompatible with toleration. Let me say, in fact, it's an example, I would say, of the toleration I'm endorsing at work. Let me also just note that toleration is not a 20th century concept. It goes back much earlier. Remember, I mentioned John Locke's letter concerning toleration, which isn't a 20th century document.
Can I just to follow up,
yeah.
because there is another piece to the question. If you believe that all religions are equally
Yeah.
valid,
Yeah.
if you were to accept that premise, which you don't, but
Yeah.
don't think,
Yeah.
is then proselytism a problem?
Well, if I believe that all religions are equally valid, which again, I don't, because if we think of all the things in the world today that go under the name of religion, I think it would be a little bit hard to make that claim. But it strikes me that it's always going to be the case that what other people believe will likely be of some interest to me. What I believe may well be of some interest to them. Sooner or later, we're going to talk about in these dialogic situations talk about our commitments and about what our ideas are, what holds them together. It just strikes me that to try to excise the possibility, to try to, again, to forestall possible moments of proselytization, of persuasion, would be to really stymie human dialogue at its base. And we just can't do that. No one has a right not to be talked to. I mean, no one has, we human beings have always engaged one another, always learned from one another. And most of the time, as you know, in situations in which someone is converted, it's not entirely a one-way street. That the way that religions change and adapt is when people come in who have come in from another faith and who wind up transforming the faith that they have converted to in certain very interesting ways as well. Add something to it that wasn't there before. Raise questions within it that perhaps were not raised before. So let me stop there because there are lots of other hands. Josh, I'll get yours towards, if that's okay, towards the end. Let me catch a few others around the room. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I was intrigued by your comment that you think one of the sources of skepticism towards proselytism is views of power, so forth, that have arisen in the last generation in intellectual life in the West.
Yes.
But it struck me that if you kind of make the case for proselytism, there's probably certain things about the human person that you would want to assume.
Sure.
One is assuming that the person is free, somewhat in the same sense that Charles Taylor said we have second-order desires. We can reflect back on any aspect of our existence and potentially change. Right. And also that essential to human dignity is a kind of search for the truth in one's freedom. And it also suggests that perhaps a person who is skeptical of proselytism maybe holds some view of the human person which might in some sense deny those things or truncate those things. Maybe they're a social constructionist, or maybe they're some form of a power reductionist, or maybe they're a materialist or something like that. So one of the paradoxes is that the person who would be most open to the kind of proselytism enterprise is probably already well down the road towards being open to that kind of thing on the philosophical kind of premises. And so I guess maybe my question is, isn't the question of proselytism really just part and parcel of a whole package of larger questions that kind of have to be unpacked first in terms of models of the person and knowledge and so forth?
Well, that's a terrific question and observation, Dan. And it strikes me that when I'm talking about proselytizing here, what I have in mind is not just I was going to this church and now I go to this church, but some profound transformation. I mean, the notion of conversion itself, as you know, is a vital turning of some kind. And I think part of what goes on perhaps is either a recognition of one's own anthropological presuppositions that one hasn't explored before, and you may find them wanting. They may not persuade you. Perhaps you have been, let's say, a strict materialist in your approach. And you find in conversations with someone who is not that your materialism is challenged in a way that you find persuasive. You have to be open to challenge on that first order, certainly. I mean, if you're going to hunker down and not go there, as we might say, then this dialogic moment is not going to be a very rich one, and the kind of process that I'm talking about is likely not to go forward. If one believes, as I used the example from John Paul II, that religious freedom speaks to the very heart of the dignity of the human person, and that freedom consists, in fact, in being able to make these choices for oneself and to reflect back on one's beliefs. And even if you were raised in a faith tradition, to rethink it as you become an adult and to make it your own in a way it wasn't when you were a child, which isn't exactly proselytization, but it's something vital and important that's going on. If you believe that if you hold to that teleological view and you think that kind of search is part of a deep yearning in human souls, not all human souls all the time, but in human souls in general, and at times people are open to exploring that, then that I think is certainly going to be part and parcel of you know, this proselytizing moment, if you will. What I want to get to here is that it's a sense of something really active, you know, not some passive, inert thing being worked on by somebody else, but an active process of questioning and back and forth where one is challenged at certain levels and can always step out of the process. You can always stop it and say, nope, I'm not going any further with this.
Question over here, Ken.
Yes, hi.
Catherine Marchand at the birthplace.
Yeah, hi.
The active, the practical,
Yeah.
roaring debates
Yeah.
around proselytization that
Yeah.
I'm aware of
Yeah.
come very often in conjunction with the provision of services and humanitarian
Yes,
needs.
yes.
And there are very complex ethical
Yes.
Dilemmas that
Yes.
are raised as to
Yes.
where the limits are.
Yes.
What is legal, but also what is
Yep.
right.
Yep.
And I'd be interested in your views on that.
Well, you know, the person in this room best equipped to respond to that is sitting to my left here, I'm sure, because he knows more of the details of the complexity of those. No, not really. The complexity of those moments in the international sphere. But if we can, I think we can. Our experience with so-called faith-based stuff in the United States perhaps helps us to think about these kinds of issues too, where you know, is it a legitimate thing if let's say if some black churches in the inner city are receiving monies under the faith-based programs to deal with gang violence? Are they permitted to use the occasions when they have young people gathered together in the church to talk about these issues? Are they permitted to do so within a framework in which, because federal monies are involved, they open and they begin with prayer, they conclude with prayer, there's preaching that goes on, and the argument as to why one should stand down from gang violence is at base a religious argument, it's an ethical argument based on religious belief. Is that something that's entirely unacceptable? Is it legal? Is it ethical? I would say it's certainly ethical. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it legal, because that depends a lot on how the courts are adjudicating these things at any given point in time. You're not saying I will withhold any service from you, you know, unless you come and listen to this sermon. These services will be available to you. But the way in which we do it here, because this is a church after all, is that we're not going to suspend our own deepest beliefs as we engage in this process. Now, I don't know if those examples, those homegrown examples, help us at all thinking about the delivery of humanitarian relief in an international context. Here, I think we have to be particularly wary and careful so that we don't make it seem as if the receipt of assistance, you know, from the United States is somehow going to be contingent upon one being available for some proselytizing effort of some kind. I don't think one can do that. I mean, it's humanitarian relief, and it should be humanitarian relief. At the same time, it seems to me that, again, for people working peacefully as religious bodies, to go to other places in the world, other communities in the world, with what it is they have to offer, which may be medical assistance, it may be education, it may be a whole lot of other things, but that very much grows out of their own deep faith commitments. For them to hide those commitments somehow would be in effect to say to them, that which gives you the power and the energy and the ethical commitment to this, you can't display in public, and I don't think one can do that. So it depends a lot, I think, on who's engaged in the activity. Is it officially government? Is it some other kind of body? One has to be respectful, obviously, of the politically delicate situations where one finds oneself, of whether you're inserting yourself into a situation where they're already very high, where feelings are running very high around certain religious issues, and be extraordinarily careful not to inflame things further, and so on. So I don't think there's one kind of rule to cover all those circumstances. I don't know if that helps or not. I'm not sure I've responded to you very adequately, but that's how I'd start to think about the issue anyway. Yes, here, and then Bill, I'll get yours.
I think that was very.
Yeah, thank
very
you.
nice. I'm a student here in
Yeah.
physics, and I just jotted down some points here.
Sure, please.
So, and I'm playing more of a devil's advocate.
That's fine. Go ahead. You're not alone.
We are talking about tolerance.
Yes.
We are talking about proselytization
Yes.
and related issues. How about tolerance towards rights of, let's say, gay community or abortion rights for those who want, or in particular, let's say, I recently became aware of women rights in certain countries where particularly Sharia is a law and bringing that. So, and deeply, so how can religious communities that
Yeah.
are so openly opposed to rights
Yeah.
of certain other communities, they demand rights to proselytization and on the same note, there are certain moral issues. For example, in our communities, we do not allow child abuse, right? We do not allow prostitution, right? So certain things, because it's a moral issue, society will
Right.
disintegrate if we allow those things. But at the same time, we allow people to argue that my religion is better than, or my God, or my view of God is better than your view of God, right? And that has created more loss of life in terms of crusades long before, or jihad right now as we know it. So why don't we think of this as a moral issue that is causing so much loss, so much suffering? And lastly, to follow up on his point,
Yeah.
that whether all religions are equal or not, you said that no, all the things that go on in name of religion, it is not accepted
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
valid religion. So let me ask you a very pointed question. Would you say, forget all religions, would you say, okay, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, or let's say Buddhism, Hinduism, would you consider these as acceptable? Not all religions, but these major streams, would you consider them as acceptable?
Well, you've put about 7 issues on the table. And let me just start working with at least some of them. First of all, I must say that maybe it's a failure of my imagination, but I fail to see some kind of inner constitutive connection between people articulating their views of God or of their faith and somehow being opposed to or somehow in favor of things like child abuse and prostitution and so on. I mean, it strikes me that if you're going to deal with issues of assaults on the dignity of human beings, then one deals with those issues, and you find resources within your faith that position you in such a way that you can name those assaults on human dignity and argue against them. And as you know, something certainly from, I'm most familiar with Western history, that it is, communities of religious belief who were central in the anti-slave trade efforts. Abolitionism was driven by Christian believers. A good bit of the women's suffrage movement historically in the United States was spearheaded by those with strong religious convictions and so on. So that's an example, really, of what I was trying to point to in my talk, which is people taking, or one of my points, people with strong religious views, taking them to the public square, displaying them in public, bringing them to bear on the political and social issues of their time. Now, when that happens, there are going to be some people who will bring their deepest beliefs to bear in ways that you might find problematic. And if you do, then you have, in a situation of toleration, you have freedom to argue against them. You can make a counter argument. You can say, I disagree profoundly, and here's why I disagree profoundly. And you can articulate the basis of your disagreement, whether it lies in faith or in some secular ideology and so on. On the issue of, you talked about abortion rights and I think oh dear, I'm getting ink all over myself here, sorry. And gay marriage and so forth. There, I think you're talking obviously about issues on which believers have deep differences. Where there's not, if you're talking about internal to the Christian community, where people do not agree. And in those circumstances, if you're in a political argument, it strikes me people are obliged again to offer the reasons for the position that they take on some of these hot button issues, and how their faith commitments position them with reference to these hot button issues one way or the other. So the best way to deal with these things, it seems to me, is not to sort of glom everything together in some sort of confused mix, but is to sort out, a whole range of issues, what tolerance may or may not have to do with them, what religious convictions of various sorts may have to say about some of these issues, people with those convictions. Do they have something to offer to the civic debate? If so, what is that? Let them tell us what it is they have to offer. And then, in the kind of situation that I was describing, we can accept what it is they're arguing or not, as the case may be. We are free to reject it. You weren't describing so much a situation of personal conversion here as, dealing with these social issues, so that's why I focused on that. On the other, about the faiths that you named and so forth, clearly I'm not going to say here, well, here's my rank ordering of these religions. One of the things we did today was to look at the ways that we can engage respectfully, some of the great religious traditions, and find out both what our commonalities are and what our points of difference are, and how we can do that precisely in an atmosphere of respect. And I would say on the society level, in a situation in which, in fact, not in our scholarly conference, but in actual practice in society, in which, again, as I said, if I'm trying to persuade others of the truth of my religious faith, I have to open myself up to persuasion in turn. That's part of the deal. It can't simply be a one-way street. So I should stop there. Bill, you had your hand up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again for this presentation. It's very rich. There's a lot to do, and I look forward to seeing it. Bill Barbieri from Catholic U, keeping your office here, more fellow. It would be very interesting to see a genealogy of how proselytization, or the right to proselytize, is bound up with the construction of religions.
Yes.
Of our conception of world religion. It strikes me that there's an asymmetry between the issue of proselytization and the issue of toleration, and that toleration is related to a broader set of religions than proselytization is. That's more narrowly with certain religions.
I see where you're going.
My concern, though, actually is with your first response and the connection that you make between the right to proselytize and the idea of dialogue, a dialogic component, which wasn't in your paper as far as I could tell.
Okay, go ahead.
So a couple of points and a question.
Okay,
about
sure.
The question is, when you introduce the idea of the right to proselytize as a dialogical thing, where you're actually engaging other views, that gets at the problem of the sort of the bad publicity of the right to proselytize, because it makes it closer to the idea of interreligious dialogue. But it seems to me you'd still want to hold to a distinction between proselytization and interreligious dialogue. My question would be, how do you spell that out? Second suggestion or question is, we talk about the right to proselytize. What are the responsibilities that go along, that are correlative? Is there a right to engage more fully with perspective, with people, with their outlooks, worldviews that you're proselytizing? And the third suggestion goes back to Taylor. The part that you left out of Taylor's Politics of Recognition, and at least in this presentation, is where he gets into this issue of dialogue. And his move is to Gadamer there, and Gadamer's idea of the fusion of horizons. And the point that he makes there is, yes, we need to judge other traditions. We can't be agnostic about that. But when we do that, it's a process where we have to be open to kind of giving up or at least revising
Sure.
our own judgments
Sure.
of value in light
Sure.
of what we learned
Sure.
with them. So
Sure.
I think that's an area where
Yeah.
there's a lot of
Yeah,
further
yeah.
potential here.
Well, that's, I was trying to get precisely at the last point you made through, if I'm attempting to persuade, then I have to be open to something coming back from you, because you're not an
You have to
inert
be open
passive
to
thing.
conversion.
Have to be open
That's
to
what
it.
David Tracy
I have to
said.
be open to it, absolutely. If I presume that you're open to conversion, I have to presume that I am open to it as well. And if this were to turn into something a lot bigger, what I would have to do would be to go into different models of proselytization. This was about models of toleration mostly, and which I hope came through clearly. I was doing some skipping. I'm not sure if it came through as clearly as I wanted it to. But I was thinking here, apropos Taylor's work, of an essay that he did in a volume on, I'm going to forget the title of it now, edited by James Heft, Father James Heft, about Catholic modernity, yes, where Taylor goes into one of his models of, as you know, proselytization, talking about Father Ricci is at it in China, and that the kind of approach to the engagement with another culture with an eye toward bringing your religious beliefs to that culture, that requires, among other things, learning the language. It requires living in community with people, spending a lot of time, not just parachuting in and saying, come hear the word and sign on. And I think that notion of a kind of patient engagement, where you go as, again, unarmed, you're not coming in there but being backed up by force and so forth, that's the sort of image that I think, but that is, I find it hard to imagine a persuasive set of arguments against the possibility of that in our world. I can certainly see arguments against proselytization backed up by force. I can see good arguments against, let's call it cheap proselytization, where I come in and use a variety of modalities to perhaps separate people out from their community and get them sort of where I want them to be, which would be more the manipulation. But the model that I have in mind, I don't see, again, any serious ethical objection that one could raise there against that. I'm not sure, well, I'll stop there. Yeah, there's more,
So,
but.
we unfortunately, we're running a little
Oh
bit
dear,
low on time.
and I promised Josh I
So
would
maybe Josh and
respond to
Jose
her.
Jose had a question too, maybe Josh and Jose could both ask their questions.
And I'll collect the questions and, okay.
Those two, and then we'll
Okay,
wrap up.
okay. All right.
So Josh, can you go first?
Sure. Proselytizing could be understood to have multiple valences, and even within Christianity, you've got minimally three ways in which one can proselytize.
Mhm.
One through dogmatics, another through apology, another through confession.
Yeah.
And these are Augustine's three
Yeah,
regulars.
yeah.
And so, one way to think of it is that there's more harder forms and softer forms.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think
yeah.
you really do need to parse that out.
Yep.
Second, on Locke and a few others, Pascal and Tocqueville as well. Yes, they presuppose, their doctrine of toleration presupposes that there are distinct modalities of experience.
Yeah.
And, Tocqueville certainly does this, and I guess one of the questions I would pose is whether the doctrine of deep toleration that you're talking about really must suppose anthropologically that there are these distinct modalities.
Yeah.
I tend to think it does, but I don't.
Yeah.
And then, on the Tocquevillian point, we so quickly move back and forth between public and private, and worry that when religion is relegated to the private, somehow it's lost its power. But one of the distinctions we simply don't have in our contemporary discussion is the distinction between direct and indirect effects. And this is Tocqueville's point.
Mhm.
Tocqueville could say that religion should completely stay out of politics, and yet at the same time declare that religion is the first and
Right.
foremost political
Right.
institution.
Right.
You can only do that by arguing that it's in this, as it were, private, non-political sphere,
Yeah.
that you form character, it spills over
Yeah.
into politics. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with private so long as you've got this indirect effect. And then secondly, Taylor, I think, has the problem of either thinking anthropologically, there's human beings are of a sort, or dialogically, but this is third alternative that might actually be really, really important for toleration, namely some notion of subsidiarity or federalism.
Yeah.
Because when all the problems come up to the top, they become viciously polarized.
Mhm.
But in fact, if you've got a political arrangement, subsidiarity and federalism, where you can push these problems down as far as you
Yeah.
possibly can, then you can have robust differences. You can have communities talking with one another. And so we've dealt with this, anthropologically and dialogically, but not politically.
Mhm.
I don't know what you would say.
Sure, sure. Yeah, this is going to be a lot to keep in mind. But go ahead, Jose.
The relation, I think, much of the problem is, of course, the relation between the two things we've been talking about.
Mhm.
Religion as a system of beliefs,
Right.
truth, conversion, and religion is a bounded community to
Mhm,
which one
mhm,
belongs, communities
mhm.
of belonging.
Mhm.
Of course, because we see the two things as going together,
Right.
then of course it's a big problem.
Right.
Proselytizing then becomes a problem. So there are three different issues. One, the issue of the possibility of multiple faiths without
Yeah.
switching belonging.
Yeah.
And, this is the mother of Gandhi, right?
Right.
I can basically be open to all the faiths, but
Yeah.
of course I'm absolutely against switching the communities of belonging. There should be. There is, and much of the Indian Hindu tradition is basically that. Very open to faiths, all kinds of tolerations, but extremely strict in the boundaries, caste
Yeah,
and
yeah,
what.
yeah.
Our own tradition, all the monotheistics are where we put the two things together. And the Chinese tradition, of course, is no affiliation, no belonging,
Right.
and multiple faiths, right? So you follow the three
Yeah,
teachings,
yeah.
most of them. So much of the question in our global age is the possibility of conceiving multiple faiths and multiple belongings. I mean, I'm thinking somebody like Raymond Panikkar. He's a very, very serious Orthodox Catholic theologian. I mean, he comes from out of the Opus Dei, but he's become a very, very important Hindu theologian
Mhm,
as well.
mhm.
And he claims to be both,
Mhm,
an
mhm.
Orthodox Hindu
Mhm.
and an Orthodox Catholic.
Mhm.
Now, if we accept this as a possibility, then obviously the whole issue also changes. The perspective
Yeah.
in which we are going to analyze those issues is going to change.
Yeah. Well, Jose, I think I'm just have to take what you said as simply an intervention, as a series of very interesting comments. But I will say, rather than a question, but I will say one thing, and that is that, first of all, it should have been clear from my talk that I don't believe that every faith is an outward proselytizing faith. Not all are, as you know. Not all believers in every religious tradition are called upon to do that. The argument I was trying to make was that those who are thus called upon to do it and who take it seriously should not be prohibited from doing that if certain things follow. That is, that there should be some prohibitions on certain ways of doing it, but it shouldn't be prohibited entirely. And then how do you work that out? And I try to do that within Taylor's framework. The other is that the possibility of multiple identities, clearly. But I think it would be very, very difficult with, faiths that claim, in a sense, through what Josh put on the table, through their dogmatics and so on. If one accepts that, you can't be sort of equally that and equally something else at the same time. If the deepest beliefs of some other faith are at odds with the dogmatics that you have embraced from the faith that you initially adhered to, just can't do it. So there are some faiths where the demands are not as strong, where you can see but not all the time. On Josh, and I know we've got to stop. Josh, I would say that on the private business, relegated to the private doesn't mean irrelevant to the public, clearly. But I think there's a difference between private and the privatization business that I was fretting about, and that I think Taylor frets about. But I also agree with your suggestion that Taylor's argument here would be stronger if he would, and it's surprising he doesn't do this actually, given that he comes out of the Catholic tradition, that he should locate some of the dialogic moments he's talking about within different institutions, and show the way in which they're sort of connected to or nestled with one another and mutually constitutive. And then you could get away from the image that does pop up in his work of this sort of private, highly privatized, subjectivized individual, and then society out here. And I do agree with you that that is an issue. So I would just say yes, a difference between private and privatizing or subjectivizing. And that's more, I think, is an epistemological principle than anything else. One that makes it very difficult to make strong truth claims if you're in that mode of subjectivism. I gotta say one other thing about Josh. I know that this is going on too long, but about his question, and that is, yes, to the distinct modalities of experience. And here, the anthropological question is lurking throughout this entire thing. You know, it really does come down to some of this rock bottom stuff about your understanding of the person, and if that's what's at stake, you know, the more places that you have for engagement, the better. So that it's not just, as you say, always going to be up here where we have our deepest disagreements and wind up with a food fight or something worse, because we can't sort those out way up here. One of the things that Niebuhr, and this would be my last comment, that Niebuhr insisted on, as you well know, was that we could, in fact, we could have these arguments about our deepest commitments and modalities of experience and anthropological presuppositions, and discover that we're just miles apart. We're just not going to agree. But that said, we could both be committed to some notion of human dignity, let's say, such that further down the road there might be some public policy that we could agree is consistent with. You know, we don't have to agree on the rock bottom stuff, but we could agree that we could both share a commitment to this particular policy because it's consistent with our commitments to human dignity, even though the ground of those differs quite dramatically. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks.
The final word, I'm sorry, we couldn't get to all the questions.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
We raised a lot of issues that we didn't resolve, but we do have this running project on religious freedom supported by the Templeton Foundation. There's some literature out there if you want to learn more about what we're doing. You can also sign up for our mailing list. Thank you all for coming, and again, please join me in thanking Jean.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon.